In a small town in Maine, the designer woman stayed quiet as the rich man returned. Morning in this part of Maine did not arrive all at once. It settled in slowly, gray light pressing against the buildings as if testing whether the town was ready to be seen. Fog drifted in low bands from the water, thin enough to let shapes appear, thick enough to soften their edges. The harbor stayed just out of focus, present without insisting on attention. Along the coastal road, storefronts held their quiet posture, wood weathered by salt, windows cleaned more out of habit than display. A few lights were already on, not bright, not inviting, simply indicating that someone was inside. Iris Calder stood behind the front window of her shop, adjusting the display. One hand steadied the frame. The other shifted a length of fabric by less than an inch. The change was small, almost unnoticeable from a street. Inside the glass, it altered how the light settled, how the color held instead of drifting. She stepped back, waited, adjusted again. The fabric caught the morning light briefly, then let it pass. The reflection in the window corrected itself. A quiet balance restored. Iris lowered her hands and left the display as it was. Outside, the street was nearly empty. Across the road, where the sidewalk widened near a closed bookstore, a man stood still. Caleb Rowan had stopped without signaling the decision. One step slower than the pace he had been keeping. His coat was buttoned against the damp air. His hands were empty, resting at his sides. He did not cross the street. He did not move closer to the window. He did not turn away. A pickup truck passed between them, tires hissing softly on the wet pavement. The sound filled the space, then thinned. When it cleared, the distance remained unchanged. Caleb stayed where he was. Inside the shop, Iris reached toward a small brass hook mounted near the edge of the window frame. It was empty. Her fingers paused there, then lowered. She left it that way. The choice registered only in the movement of her hand. She smoothed the corner of a small card resting at the base of the display. No price written, no description, just a single stitched line pressed into the paper, subtle enough to disappear unless someone was already looking for it. The bell above the door did not ring. No one entered. No one needed to. For a moment, Iris's reflection layered with the faint outline of the man across the street. Fog, glass, and distance combined them into one image, then separated them again as she shifted her weight. She looked up. Caleb met her eyes. The look did not hold. It did not ask to be answered. It registered, then released, the way the tide pulls back from the dock without taking anything with it. Iris did not smile. She did not frown. She lifted her hand once, not toward him, but toward the corner of the display where the light had slipped again. The movement was brief, complete. Where her hand lowered, the window held its balance. Caleb nodded, as if to the glass itself. He stepped back half a pace. He did not leave. A woman walking her dog slowed near the curb. She looked at the window, then at Caleb, then back at the window again. The dog pulled forward impatient. She said nothing and continued down the street. Farther along, a door opened and closed. Someone swept a step, knowing the wind would undo it. A gull cried somewhere out of sight, the sound stretched thin by distance and damp air. Inside, Iris turned away from the glass and returned to her work table. She opened her notebook, then closed it without writing. The heater clicked on briefly, then off. Outside, Caleb glanced at his watch. Not because he was late, because time had passed. Later, people would remember the fog, or the quiet weight of the morning. Few would remember the exact distance between the window and the sidewalk. Fewer still would remember that no one crossed it. But the space had been seen, not commented on, not claimed. And in a town that understood how to notice without asking, that was enough to let the day continue. The town revealed itself in layers rather than statements. By late morning, the fog thinned just enough to let the harbor show its outline. Not the water itself at first, but the idea of it. Pilings appeared as dark vertical marks. The dock followed, then the low shapes of boats resting in their slips. The tide moved with a steady, even rhythm, small waves tapping wood without urgency. No crashing surf, no spectacle, just repetition, patient and exact. Cold sea air pressed inland, damp rather than sharp. It settled into jackets, into door frames, into the grain of the buildings themselves. Breath showed briefly, then disappeared. Drizzle came and went without committing to rain, leaving a sheen on the road that reflected light back up into the gray sky. The coastal road curved instead of insisting on a straight line. It followed the land the way it always had, bending around low rises, dipping toward the water, then lifting again. Houses along it were built to endure rather than impress. Weathered shingles, porch railings worn smooth by hands that had rested there for years. Paint softened by salt and time. Nothing hurried to look new. People moved through the morning without announcing themselves. A diner door opened and closed. The bell rang once, then stopped. Coffee filled cups. Plates slid across the counter. Someone swept a step, pushing grit toward the edge, knowing the wind would bring it back before noon. A pickup truck idled at the corner longer than necessary, then turned toward the dock. Familiar faces passed one another with minimal exchange. A nod, a brief lift of the chin. Names were used sparingly, like tools rather than greetings. No one asked questions that required a story in return. The town ran on recognition, not explanation. Rough outside, gentle inside. That balance showed in the small things. A door held open without comment. A glove returned to a counter without a lecture about carelessness. A bowl of chowder set down in front of someone who had not ordered yet, because the cook had noticed the cold in their hands. The dock carried its own rhythm. Fishermen worked with practiced economy, hands moving without wasted motion. Nets were lifted, checked, and set aside. Ropes were coiled tight, then loosened again as the tide adjusted them inch by inch. Engines started low, idled, then cut. Sound traveled farther over water, softened by mist. A gull cried somewhere out of sight. Another answered, farther out, the sound stretched thin by distance. The birds came and went without ceremony, just as they always had. Near the end of the dock, someone paused longer than usual, leaning on the railing to watch the water flatten and reform. A moment passed, then another. The tide did not change for the pause, but it did not resist it either. In town shops, open without flourish. The hardware store lights flicked on. Boxes were stacked in the same places they had been yesterday. The post office door swung inward and stayed there, propped open with a piece of worn wood that fit the threshold exactly. The library remained cool longer than the rest of the buildings, its quiet holding even as footsteps crossed the floor. Iris Calder's shop fit into the street the way it always had. The window stayed clear only at certain angles. From the outside, it reflected the street more than it revealed the interior. From inside, the light settled just right over the work table. Fabric lay folded with precision rather than display. Thread spools rested where they could be reached without looking. People treated the shop as a necessity, not a destination. A hem adjusted before Sunday. A seam reinforced before the real cold arrived. A zipper replaced without comment. Items were set down, needs stated plainly, and work taken up without ceremony. No compliments meant to buy favor. No questions meant to invite explanation. The work spoke quietly for itself. Across town, routine held just as firmly. Caleb Rowan moved through the same spaces without calling attention to the fact. A man in a coat, walking familiar routes. Not hidden, not performing presence. Simply there. He passed the dock without stopping some mornings. Other days, he stood long enough to notice a rope set poorly, then continued on. At the grocery store, he chose what he needed and nothing more. Bread, soup, apples. At the counter, the receipt slid across the surface. Fingers did not touch. No one commented on the weather unless it required adjustment. At the library, he returned a book and took another from the shelf without reading the back. He chose by weight, by how it fit his hand. He sat near the window until the light shifted enough to reach the page, then stood. The town did not ask where he was from. That was not indifference. That was boundary. In places like this, people learn one another by pattern rather than history, by who showed up consistently, by who did not disrupt the shape of the day, by how space was respected. Winter light moved slowly across the street. It caught on windows, then slid away. It softened edges without warming them. The sky stayed undecided, gray layered over gray. The The fog returned in bands, lifting near the water, thickening closer to town, then reversing itself without warning. Someone noticed the man standing across from the shop earlier that morning. Someone noticed the light inside, staying on a few minutes longer than usual. Someone noticed and kept walking. Not everything observed became a subject. That was part of how the town stayed intact. By afternoon, the drizzle eased. The road darkened where it had been wet, then lightened again. Footsteps sounded more clearly. A door slammed farther down the block, then reopened with less force. At the dock, boats came in earlier than expected. At the diner, a chair scraped once and was righted. At the post office, the piece of wood still held the door at the same angle. Nothing remarkable happened, and that was the point. Maine did not offer itself quickly. It allowed itself to be inhabited. It made room for repetition, for small variations that did not ask to be explained. It let people stay quiet inside routines that held. By late afternoon, the fog thinned again, revealing the curve of the coastal road as it disappeared and returned in the distance. The harbor breathed in its steady way. The town carried on, and within that quiet order, the space between people remained unforced. Seen when necessary, left alone when not. That was how the world here worked. Caleb Rowan woke before the morning made any claim on the day. The room stayed dim, the light outside still undecided. Gray pressed gently through the window, enough to suggest shape without offering detail. The sound reached him first. Water, steady and even moving somewhere beyond the glass. No cras, no pull, just the repeated motion that had nothing to prove. He lay still long enough to hear it settle into the space. Then he stood. The floor was cold. He did not react to it. He crossed the room and opened the window a few inches wider, letting the damp air move in. Salt followed, not sharp, familiar. It carried the rhythm of the tide more clearly now, each wave arriving and leaving without urgency. In the kitchen, he set the kettle on the stove and reached for the coffee. Whole beans. Up blainyar. He measured by habit, not scale. The grinder turned slowly under his hand, the sound filling the room just enough to mark time. When the water reached temperature, he poured into the French press, stirred once, and stepped back. He did not watch it steep. While the coffee rested, he sat at the small table near the window and opened his notebook. The pages were thick, slightly rough. He wrote a few lines, not sentences meant to explain anything. Measurements. A hinge that needed tightening. A reminder to pick up thread from the repair shop later in the week. He closed the notebook when the page felt complete. The coffee was ready. He poured it into a single mug and carried it to the chair facing the water. From there, the ocean filled the frame whether he looked directly at it or not. The light had shifted enough to show the surface moving in long, unbroken lines. No beat-the-cups, no drama. He drank slowly. When the mug was empty, he rinsed it and left it upside down to dry. Then he pulled on his coat and stepped outside. The coastal path was damp from overnight mist. Grass bent under the weight of moisture. Pebbles pressed into the dirt where others had walked before him. He followed the curve of the land without adjusting his pace, boots finding familiar ground. Farther along, near a stretch of rock that dipped toward the water, harbor seals rested together. Dark shapes against darker stone. One lifted its head briefly as Caleb approached, then settled again. He sat on a piece of driftwood a short distance away. He did not move closer. He watched the water slide around them, tracing the same pattern again and again until it stopped feeling like time passing at all. When the cold worked its way into his legs, he stood. By the time he reached town, the morning had taken shape. The dock was awake now. Boats idled low, engines restrained. Ropes creaked against pilings. Nets hung stiff with salt, catching the light in dull threads. Caleb stood near the edge of the pier and watched the fishermen work. He did not step in unless asked. A line tangled briefly around a cleat. He crouched, freed it, and handed it back. The man took it and nodded once, already focused on the next task. At the diner, Caleb took his usual seat near the counter. Eggs, toast, coffee refilled without asking. He ate slowly, not reading the paper, not filling the space. With talk, the room moved around him in low conversation, familiar voices rising and falling without anchoring anywhere. Afterward, he walked to the grocery store. The aisles were narrow. He picked up bread, soup, apples. At the register, the clerk slid the receipt across the counter. Their fingers did not touch. Outside, the air had warmed slightly, still damp, still gray. He stopped by the repair shop next. A jacket seam had begun to pull at the shoulder. He handed it over, pointed to the spot, and waited while the owner examined it. No ruse, no negotiation. He would pick it up when it was ready. From there, he went to the library. The building stayed cool longer than most. He returned a book and chose another without reading the back. He selected it by weight, by how it fit his hand. He sat at a table near the window and read until the light shifted enough to reach the page. That was his signal. He left before the room warmed. Back at the cottage, he fixed a loose hinge on the back door. The metal protested briefly, then settled. He stitched a small tear in his sweater, the repair visible but clean. He set it aside and swept the porch, pushing damp leaves into a corner where the wind would eventually reclaim them. The afternoon passed without marker. Sometimes he walked the beach again. Sometimes he stood near the water longer than planned, watching waves flatten and reform without urgency. When the wind picked up sharply, he closed the windows and listened to it press against the walls. On Sundays, he went to the church. He arrived after the service had begun and slipped into the back pew. The wood creaked softly under his weight. Light filtered through tall windows in narrow bands, settling on worn floors and old hymnals. He did not bow his head. He did not speak. No prayer spoken. No doctrine followed. Only wood, light, and the back row. He stayed until the room felt settled, then left the way he came. In the evenings, when the town drew inward again, Caleb sometimes went to the small bar near the harbor. He ordered soup or one drink and took a seat where he could listen without being drawn into conversation. If a chair wobbled, he tightened it. If a door stuck, he adjusted the latch. He did not announce the fixes. He paid and left. The routine did not belong only to him. It intersected with others without claiming them. The fisherman who nodded once. The clerk who remembered his order. The librarian who slid a book across the counter without comment. The town absorbed his presence the way it absorbed weather. He did not move this way to arrive anywhere. He kept the pattern so nothing broke. Each action stayed small, manageable, repeated, capacity used without display, silence held where words were unnecessary, discipline expressed through return rather than restraint. Morning after morning, the kettle sounded the same. The water moved the same way. The road curved where it always had. The dock breathed with the tide. And Caleb Rowan moved within it, not separate from the town, not fused to it either. Just present, repeated, held in place by the steady work of showing up, doing what was needed, and leaving the rest untouched. The routine continued, quietly, without asking to be noticed. Iris Calder did not enter the town as someone new. She was already there, folded into its daily movements the way certain buildings were folded into the shoreline. People did not point her out. They adjusted around her without comment. Her presence belonged to the rhythm rather than the story. Caleb Rowan noticed her first as a pattern. At the grocery store, she arrived just after the morning delivery, when the aisles were still narrow with boxes. She waited without checking her phone, hands resting loosely at her sides. When a clerk apologized for the delay, she shook her head once, small and final, as if time had not been taken from her. At the library, she chose the same table near the window, but never stayed long enough to claim it. She returned books on time, sometimes early, never with explanation. At the dock, she stood at the far end where the boards dipped slightly underfoot. She watched the water rather than the boats. When someone needed to pass, she stepped aside before being asked. Caleb registered all of this without assembling it. One morning, as he stood near the repair shop waiting for his jacket, Iris was already there. She held a roll of measuring tape in one hand, the end tucked neatly into itself. The owner spoke to her first. "Morning, Iris," he said. "Morning," she replied. No further greeting followed. Caleb stepped forward when the owner turned to him. The jacket was placed on the counter between them, mended, the stitch visible but clean. "That will hold," the owner said. Caleb nodded. Thank you. Iris did not look at the jacket. She did not look at him. She waited until the owner finished with Caleb before setting her tape down. The zipper arrived? She asked. In the back, the owner said. I will grab it. While they waited, the radio hummed softly behind the counter. The bell on the door rang once as someone passed outside without coming in. Iris stood a full step back from the counter, leaving space that did not need to be negotiated. Her posture was upright, but unguarded. When the owner returned and handed her the small paper sleeve, she checked the length, nodded once, and slipped it into her bag. That will do, she said. She paid and turned toward the door. As she passed Caleb, she paused just enough to register him. Her eyes lifted briefly, not scanning, not searching. Good morning, she said. Good morning, he replied. That was all. Outside, the wind pressed lightly along the street, carrying the smell of salt and wet wood. Iris mounted her bicycle and secured the bag to the rear rack with practiced movements. The strap slipped once. She adjusted it without looking down. Caleb watched from the doorway of the shop, not because she asked for attention, but because the motion had already entered his field of view. She rode away at a steady pace, not fast, not tentative. Later that week, Caleb saw her again at the diner. She sat near the window, black coffee untouched in front of her. A notebook lay closed beside it. When the waitress approached, Iris shook her head slightly, signaling she was not ready. The waitress nodded and moved on without remark. Caleb took his usual seat at the counter. Their backs were not aligned. Their sight lines did not cross. The room moved quietly around them, familiar voices settling and dispersing. When Iris stood to leave, she did not rush. She placed a bill beneath the cup, tucked the notebook under her arm, and stepped outside into the gray light. The detail that marked her as safe was not dramatic. It was how she handled what did not belong to her. One afternoon, near the dock, a loose coil of rope sat half in the walkway. A fisherman stepped over it without noticing. Iris stopped, bent, and pulled it fully aside, setting it against the piling where it would not catch a foot. She did not look around afterward to see who might have noticed. Caleb saw the motion from a distance. He did not approach. Another day at the post office, the door stuck briefly against the frame. Iris held it open for the woman behind her, then stepped through without comment. When the door swung back into place, she did not test it again. She did not fix what she had not been asked to fix. This was noticed, not as praise, as orientation. At the workshop, her lights came on early and went off when the work reached its stopping point. Sometimes that was late. Sometimes it was not. No explanation appeared in the window. Caleb passed the shop often before he recognized it as hers. The glass was kept clear, but not inviting. Inside, fabric lay folded with care. The display shifted subtly from day to day, never calling attention to itself, never repeating exactly. One empty hook remained in the corner of the frame, and used. One evening, as fog gathered low along the street, Caleb stopped across the road without intending to. Iris stood inside, adjusting a length of cloth by less than an inch. She stepped back, tilted her head, adjusted it again. The light held differently afterward. Caleb did not cross the street. Iris did not look up. A woman walking her dog slowed near the curb, glanced at the window, then continued on. The dog pulled forward. Nothing passed between the man and the woman in the shop. And yet, the space held. When Iris finally looked up, her gaze reached the glass first. Caleb stood reflected there, faintly layered with the street behind him. Their eyes met through the surface, briefly, without signal. She did not smile. She did not frown. She returned her attention to the fabric. Caleb nodded once, not to her, but to the settled shape of the window. Then he stepped back half a pace. He did not leave. The fog thickened, thinning again near the ground. A gull called somewhere out of sight. Iris turned away from the window and returned to her work table. She opened her notebook, wrote one line, then closed it. Outside, Caleb checked the time without urgency and continued down the street. No curiosity had been invited. No explanation was owed. The woman had entered the story without entering his space. Present, contained, allowed. In a town that understood how to move alongside rather than toward, that was enough for now. and the day continued. The first contact did not belong to either of them. It passed through someone else, briefly, the way weather passed through town without asking to be noticed. Late afternoon settled over the street with its usual restraint. The fog had lifted just enough to show the bend of the coastal road, then paused there, undecided. The air stayed cold and damp. Sound traveled shorter distances. Iris called her, locked her workshop, and turned the sign to back soon. She did not hurry. The fabric inside had cooled enough to rest. The light behind the glass went dark. She walked toward the small repair and hardware shop 2 blocks down, a folded jacket tucked under her arm. The shoulder seam had begun to pull. Nothing urgent. Something that would worsen if ignored. Inside, the bell over the door rang once. Caleb Rowan stood near the back, looking through a shallow tray of brass screws. The owner was not at the counter. A radio played low somewhere behind the shelves. Iris stopped just inside the doorway, registering the space before stepping further in. She waited until Caleb shifted slightly to the side. "Excuse me," she said. He stepped back without comment. She placed the jacket on the counter, smoothing the sleeve once. The owner returned and picked it up, turning it over. "Reinforce it," Iris said. "That fabric carries weight there." The owner nodded. "Tomorrow afternoon." Caleb glanced at the jacket only then. "That is mine," he said. The owner looked between them. "All right." He carried the jacket toward the back room. The radio crackled briefly, then settled again. The bell rang as someone passed outside without coming in. "I will put on my tab," Iris said. Caleb turned toward her. "You do not have to." "I know," she replied. That ended the exchange. They stepped outside at the same time. The light had thinned toward evening. The street darkened with mist. Somewhere farther down, a door closed. A gull cried once and went quiet. "I'm heading toward the dock," Iris said. "So am I," Caleb replied. They did not coordinate pace. They walked. The dock was quieter than earlier in the day. Most boats were in. Nets hung still. The water moved evenly, catching what little light remained. They stopped near the railing, a few feet apart. Iris rested her hands on the wood, feeling the grain beneath her palms. "Wind is shifting," she said. "Yes," Caleb answered. They watched the water. After a moment, she spoke again. "Fog usually comes back around dusk." "It does," he said. The horizon softened as the first layer rolled in. "I should get back," Iris said. "Of course." She turned, then paused. "If the seam gives again," she said, "bring it by earlier. That fabric responds better before it stretches." "I will," Caleb replied. She left without waiting. Caleb stayed at the railing a while longer. Nothing in the exchange asked to be expanded. No curiosity followed. No personal detail was offered or withheld. The contact passed through a task, through a jacket, through the shared understanding of how things wore over time. On the walk back into town, Iris passed the grocery store as its lights came on. Someone inside laughed, then lowered their voice. The fog thickened near the ground. Caleb turned in the opposite direction, following the curve of the road that led home. His hands stayed in his coat pockets. The air pressed in, cold but steady. The town continued around them. At the bar near the harbor later that evening, Iris sat near the wall with a bowl of soup cooling in front of her. She did not eat right away. Caleb took a seat at the far end of the counter and ordered the same. They did not acknowledge each other. A chair wobbled at a nearby table. Someone adjusted it with their foot. The room settled again. When Caleb stood to leave, he passed Iris's table without slowing. "You will get it tomorrow," she said, not looking up. "Yes," he replied. The door closed behind him. Iris finished her soup and stood. She pulled her jacket on and stepped outside into the fog. The street lights blurred. Sound dulled. The first contact had happened. Not between two people reaching. Between two people moving through the same town, allowing the same moment to pass through them, unchanged. It was enough to continue walking the same routes without adjusting their steps. Enough to be noticed once, and then left alone. And the night settled back into its quiet order. The shift did not announce itself. It arrived the way small changes did in town, without warning, without permission, and without asking anyone to agree on what it meant. Morning came gray again. The tide had turned sometime before dawn. The dock smelled sharper than usual, metal and salt. A loose plank near the far end creaked when stepped on, a sound most people had learned to avoid. Caleb Rowan stepped onto the dock after sunrise, earlier than the fishermen, but later than the gulls. He carried no tools with him at first. He walked the length once, slow, hands in his coat pockets, eyes moving where they always did, over cleats, ropes, edges that caught. Near the third piling from the end, a coil of rope lay half in the water. It had slipped sometime during the night, soaked and heavy. It belonged to no one in particular anymore. Boats shifted ownership of small things all the time. Caleb crouched and lifted it back onto the boards. Water ran off in thin lines. He coiled it tighter, set it against the piling where it would dry. He stood, looked once more down the dock, then walked back toward town. At the hardware shop, he bought a box of galvanized nails and a small pry bar. He paid in cash. No explanation followed the purchase. The clerk nodded once and slid the receipt into the drawer. Back at the dock, he knelt by the loose plank. It had lifted just enough to catch a boot heel. Not broken, not urgent, not a sign to anyone. He levered it up, slid the board aside, reset the joist beneath. The work took longer than expected. Cold stiffened his fingers. The fog rolled in again, thinner now, moving sideways with the breeze. A man walking his dog slowed as he passed. "You fixing that?" the man asked. Caleb nodded. "That board has been like that a while," the man said. Caleb did not answer. The man waited a moment longer than necessary, then continued on. By mid-morning, the plank sat flat again. Caleb tapped in the nails, flush. He stood, tested it with his weight. It held. He wiped his hands on his jeans and packed the pry bar away. He left without, marking the repair. When Iris Calder came down to the dock later, carrying a paper-wrapped bundle of fabric samples for a client near the harbor, she noticed the change immediately. She stepped where she always did. The board did not shift. She paused, looked down, then continued walking. At the end of the dock, she stopped near the water, unwrapped the fabric enough to check the colors in natural light. The wind lifted the edges. She weighted them with her hand. Caleb stood several yards away, leaning against a piling, not watching her directly. A fisherman approached Iris from the opposite side. "Someone fixed that board," he said, nodding behind them. She glanced back again. "Yes," she said. "About time," he added. She did not agree or disagree. Caleb straightened slightly, then turned as if to leave. Iris called after him, not raising her voice. "You left the nails exposed," she said. He stopped. "They will rust faster," she continued. "The salt gets in. It is better to countersink them." He looked back at the board. "I can come back," he said. She shook her head. "It is fine," she replied. "It will hold for now." That was all. No thanks followed. No curiosity. Caleb walked away. The town noticed, though not in the way he might have expected. At the diner near noon, someone mentioned the dock in passing. The waitress shrugged. "Probably the town will get to it eventually," she said. "It is already done," someone else replied. "By who?" No answer came. The conversation moved on to the weather. At the post office, the clerk complained about the draft near the door. A regular shifted a chair to block it better. No one commented. By afternoon, Caleb returned to the dock once more, this time carrying a countersink bit borrowed from the repair shop. He knelt again, worked quietly, redid the nails one by one. No one stopped him. When he finished, he sat at the edge of the dock for a moment, legs hanging over the water. The tide had gone out. The rocks below showed dark and slick. Iris passed again on her way back toward town. She slowed, watched him work from a distance, then continued walking without altering her route. Later that day, at the grocery store, Iris overheard two women speaking near the produce. "The dock feels safer lately," one said. "Does it?" the other replied. "Less shifting." They moved on. In the evening, at the bar, Caleb ordered a drink and took his usual seat. Someone nodded at him. Another slid a coaster closer when he set his glass down. No one mentioned the dock. Iris entered later, took a seat at her usual table. She ordered soup. When it arrived, she stirred it once and let it cool. Caleb stood to leave before she finished. As he passed, she spoke, low and even. "The rope by the third piling will dry faster if you move it tomorrow." He paused. "All right," he said. No tone followed. No invitation. He left. The shift settled in quietly. The town did not respond with gratitude or suspicion. It adjusted the way it always did, absorbing the change without comment, reassigning it to the background. Caleb continued his routines. He fixed nothing else that day. He did not look for more work. Iris returned to her workshop and adjusted the window display again, this time changing the spacing between two pieces of cloth by less than an inch. Outside, a passerby stopped briefly, noticing both the window and the street beyond it. No one said anything. The dock held. The town kept moving. And something small, unannounced, had shifted the way space was shared, without asking either of them what it should mean. The tension did not arrive as an argument. It formed in the space that remained when nothing more was said. The dock stayed steady after the repair. People walked it without slowing. Boots passed over the plank as if it had always been that way. The town adjusted its weight and moved on. Caleb Rowan noticed the looks first. Not direct. Never direct. A fisherman glanced longer than usual when Caleb crossed the harbor road. A woman at the bakery paused with the paper bag half folded, eyes lifting and dropping again. At the library, the return desk clerk waited an extra second before sliding his card back across the counter. None of it was unfriendly. None of it invited response. Caleb kept his posture unchanged. Shoulders even. Pacha steady. He did not look back to confirm what he already knew. Iris called her notice something else. From inside her workshop, she could see the street in fragments through the glass. A shoulder passing. A reflection. The way people slowed just enough. When they reached the corner near the dock, as if adjusting to a memory they could not place. She did not step outside. She stayed with her hands. Fabric, pins, chalk. The work asked for precision. It also allowed silence. Late morning, Caleb passed her shop. He did not stop. His reflection crossed the window, faint, broken by the seam lines of the display. Iris looked up just as he moved past the edge of the glass. Their eyes did not meet. The moment lingered anyway. At the grocery store that afternoon, they stood in the same aisle without planning it. Caleb reached for a bag of rice. Iris stood a few feet away, reading a label. Neither shifted position. The distance between them stayed exact. Close enough to acknowledge. Far enough to avoid interruption. A cart rolled by, wheels squeaking slightly. Caleb placed the rice in his basket. Iris set the jar back on the shelf and took another. Their movements did not synchronize. They did not avoid each other either. When Iris turned, her gaze passed over him once. Not measuring, not questioning, simply registering where he was. Caleb felt it without looking. At the counter, she checked out first. He waited behind, leaving a space equal to the width of one floor tile. Outside, the fog thinned. The air smelled cleaner, almost metallic. They walked in opposite directions. The tension held. That evening, the dock filled briefly at sunset. A few locals came to watch the water change color. No one spoke much. Gulls circled and settled. Caleb leaned against the same piling as the day before. Iris stood closer to the end, arms folded loosely, coat open. From where he stood, he could see the edge of her profile. From where she stood, she could see his boots. Neither adjusted position to gain more. A man stepped onto the dock and paused at the repaired plank. "Feels solid," he said, mostly to himself. Caleb did not respond. Iris shifted her weight slightly. The wood creaked once, then settled. The man walked on. Silence returned, thicker now, shaped by what had already happened. Caleb watched the water below the dock. The tide was low again. Rocks showed through, dark and wet. He counted the small movements, the way kelp lifted and dropped. Iris watched the horizon. The light flattened, turning the water gray instead of blue. There, lines of sight did not cross, but the space between them stayed charged, held by restraint rather than distance. When Iris turned to leave, she paused near him, not facing him fully. "The wind will pick up tonight," she said. He nodded. "That corner will rattle again," she added, meaning the loose metal sign near the storage shed. "I will hear it," he replied. She did not suggest fixing it. He did not offer to. That was where the tension settled. Not in refusal, not in agreement, in the choice to leave the next move unclaimed. She walked away first. Caleb stayed a moment longer, then followed his usual route back into town. Later, at the bar, the atmosphere felt tighter than the night before. Conversations dipped when someone stood. Chairs scraped more quietly. Caleb took his seat. Iris arrived after him, choosing a table near the wall. Their eyes met once across the room. No expression changed. The look lasted only long enough to confirm presence. Then it broke. A pause settled into the room, almost imperceptible. Someone exhaled audibly. Another person laughed, too loud, then softened it. The bar resumed its low hum. Caleb finished his drink slower than usual. Iris did the same. Neither moved to close the space. When Caleb stood to leave, Iris was still seated. She watched him reach the door, then looked back down at her bowl. The tension did not resolve. It did not need to. It existed as a held breath within the routine, a quiet pressure that did not demand release. Outside, the wind picked up as predicted. The metal sign rattled once, then again. Caleb paused on the sidewalk, listening. He had not turned back. Inside the workshop, Iris closed her curtains against the evening chill. She stood still for a moment after, hands resting on the fabric table, breathing even, unhurried. The town absorbed the silence. Nothing broke. Nothing settled. And in the space where words could have gone, the quiet remained intact, steady enough to hold what came next. Morning returned without ceremony. The harbor road dried unevenly after a night of light rain. Patches of asphalt held darker shapes where water had settled longer. The tide had turned sometime before dawn. The boats sat lower, ropes slack, hulls quiet against the dock. Caleb Rowan stepped out at his usual hour. Same coat, same pace. The routine had not shifted outwardly, but it no longer felt sealed. Across the street, Iris Calder unlocked her shop. She lifted the metal gate halfway, paused, then raised it the rest of the way. The sound echoed briefly and disappeared. They noticed each other at the same time. Not a signal, not a decision, just awareness. Caleb crossed the street, but stopped short of her door. He remained on the edge of the sidewalk, close enough to be counted, far enough to keep the threshold intact. She did not step back inside. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he replied. The exchange carried no invitation. It also carried no closure. She adjusted the sign on the window, straightening a corner that had slipped during the night. He watched her hands, then looked away, giving the space back. A delivery truck idled farther down the street. A gull cried once and lifted off. Iris locked the door again, not because she felt rushed, but because she was finished for the moment. She turned, key still in hand. "I'm walking toward the pier," she said. Caleb nodded. "I'm headed that way, too." Neither asked the other to join. They fell in a step without aligning fully, one half step apart, enough to share direction without sharing stride. The road curved gently toward the water. Their coats moved differently in the wind. His heavier, resisting. Hers lighter, adjusting. They walked together for a block. At the corner near the fish market, Iris slowed. "I'm turning here," she said. Caleb stopped with her. He did not look surprised. "I will keep going," he said. They stood for a moment where the sidewalk split. The boundary was visible, drawn by habit and choice rather than distance. Neither crossed it. "Later," she said. "Later," he replied. She turned down the narrower street, toward the workshops near the water. He continued straight, toward the dock and the open stretch beyond. The separation did not feel like retreat. It felt precise. At the pier, Caleb leaned against the railing and watched the boats. He stayed longer than usual, not waiting, just present. Iris reached the end of her street and stopped beside the water. She sat on a low crate, hands folded loosely, watching the surface change color as clouds passed overhead. They were apart, but the town held both positions at once. By midday, the rhythm shifted again. They crossed paths at the post office, arriving from opposite directions. The line was short. They stood one person apart. Iris finished first. She stepped aside, leaving space for him to approach the counter. When she turned to leave, she paused beside him. "There is coffee at the harbor shed this afternoon," she said. "Open table." He considered the phrasing. "Thank you," he said. She did not wait for an answer beyond that. The offer remained suspended. Available. Unclaimed. That was the shape of it now. In the afternoon, the wind picked up. The harbor shed filled briefly, then thinned. Caleb arrived, ordered coffee, and sat at the far end of the table. Iris arrived later. She took a seat closer to the door. They shared the space without closing it. Conversation moved around them. Names, errands, weather. Neither of them redirected it. At one point, Iris stood to leave. "You do not have to answer yet," she said, lightly, not looking directly at him. The words landed as a permission, not a request. He nodded once. She left. Caleb stayed until his cup was empty. When he stood, he did not follow. Outside, the harbor continued its steady movement. Boats shifted, lines creaked, people passed, and did not look twice. The boundary had not hardened. The trust had not expanded dramatically, but something had moved one step, enough to allow choice, enough to allow distance, enough to let both remain inside the town without claiming more than the day offered. The afternoon shifted without announcement. Clouds loosened over the water, letting in a brighter band of light that slid across the dock and then moved on. The temperature held steady. The wind changed direction once, just enough to lift paper scraps and lay them back down. Caleb Rowan was near the outer pier, checking a loose board that had lifted slightly at one corner. It was not his responsibility. No one had asked. He pressed it down, tested it with his weight, then stepped away when it held. A man from the lobster boat nodded once from the deck. No words followed. Farther along the harbor, Iris Calder stepped out of a supply shop carrying a narrow box tied with twine. She adjusted the knot as she walked, careful not to rush. The lid shifted once, then settled. Their paths crossed again without intention. She slowed when she saw him. Near the water, he did not move closer. The distance remained workable. A child ran past them both, chasing a gull that refused to cooperate. The bird lifted at the last second, wings brushing air that had already moved on. The child stumbled on the edge of the pier. Not a fall. Not quite. Caleb noticed first. His body shifted forward, ready, then stopped. The child regained balance without help, palms landing hard on wood, knees bent. The moment closed. No hands reached. No relief was named. The child laughed and ran on. Iris watched the exchange from where she stood. She did not comment. She retied the twine, once more than necessary, then continued walking. Later, at the grocery store, a different rhythm took over. Shelves were half-stocked. A handwritten sign near the milk case explained the delay. People read it, then moved on. Caleb waited his turn at the counter. When it came, he paid in cash, gathered his items, and stepped aside to let the next person through. Iris entered just as he turned away. They passed in the narrow aisle between canned goods and bread. He shifted his bag to give her room. She nodded, brief and precise. At the checkout, the cashier hesitated over the change, then realized the register had jammed. "I will fix it," Caleb said, already stepping back toward the counter. He did not touch the machine. He did not advise. He held the drawer steady while the cashier reset it. It took less than a minute. The line moved again. No one thanked him directly. No one needed to. Outside, Iris waited while tying her scarf tighter against the wind. When Caleb exited, she held the door open a moment longer than required, then let it swing closed behind him. The courtesy passed without acknowledgement. In the late afternoon, rain moved in sideways, light but persistent. The dock darkened again. The sound of it softened the harbor. A loose tarp flapped against a railing near the boat shed. Iris noticed it first. She paused, considered the distance, then stepped closer. The knot had slipped. She pulled it tight, fingers cold, then stepped back. The tarp settled. The sound stopped. Caleb had watched from the end of the shed. He did not approach. When she finished, he nodded once, already turning away. At the library, the heater clicked on and off, uneven, but sufficient. Chairs scraped quietly as people shifted positions. Iris sat near the window, notebook closed beside her. She was not writing. She was waiting for the sound of rain to even out. Caleb stood at the shelves, scanning spines without selecting anything. He stopped near a book on local tides, pulled it halfway out, then returned it to its place. They did not sit together. They shared the same silence without aligning it. At closing time, The librarian flicked the lights once as warning. Chairs moved. People gathered coats. Outside, dusk came early. The rain thinned to mist. On the steps, Iris adjusted her bag. Caleb waited a few feet away, hands in his pockets, gazed toward the harbor lights beginning to come on. "You left the tarp better than I would have," he said. She shrugged lightly. It just needed to be tighter. The exchange stayed within function. No expansion followed. They walked in the same direction for half a block, then separated again, each choosing a different turn without explanation. At the end of the street, a delivery truck struggled to back into a narrow space. The driver leaned out the window, checking clearance. Caleb stopped. He raised one hand, signaling distance, then lowered it when the truck settled cleanly into place. The driver lifted a thumb. That was all. Iris had already turned the corner. Night arrived without ceremony. Lights reflected in wet pavement. The harbor settled. Doors closed. The day held its small motions together, not as progress, not as setback, but as proof of contact that did not need to be completed. What had almost happened did not. What had happened left no mark. The town kept moving, one courtesy at a time, unremarked, sufficient. The consequence did not arrive as a problem. It arrived as a detail that did not sit quite where it belonged. Late morning brought a thin brightness that never fully warmed the street. The fog had lifted just enough for the harbor to show its edges again. Boats moved in their slow order. Nothing unusual. Caleb Rowan stopped by the repair shop to pick up a hinge he had left behind earlier in the week. The bell rang once. The owner looked up, reached under the counter, and set the small paper bag down. "You can put on Iris's tab," the owner said, already turning away. Caleb paused. "It is mine," he said. The owner nodded, distracted. "Right. She mentioned it." She had not. Caleb paid without correcting him. He folded the receipt and slipped it into his pocket. The exchange ended cleanly, but the sentence remained where it had landed. Outside, the street continued. Across town, Iris Calder stood at her work table with the front door open. Light from the street moved across the floor in a narrow band. She adjusted a pattern, then set it aside, then returned to it again without changing anything. A woman from a neighboring shop stepped in briefly to return a borrowed pair of scissors. "You saw Caleb earlier?" the woman asked, casual. "Yes," Iris replied. "He asked about you," the woman said. "Just whether you were in?" Iris looked up. "He did." "That is what I heard," the woman said, already stepping back toward the door. "Anyway, thank you for the scissors." The door closed. The workshop stayed quiet. The detail was small. It did not ask to be resolved. It did not explain itself. It simply shifted the weight of the day. That afternoon, Iris walked to the dock later than usual. She stopped at the railing where she often stood. The water moved evenly. A gull cried once and then went silent. Caleb was already there. They did not greet each other right away. "You picked up the hinge," Iris said finally. "Yes," Caleb replied. Another pause. "They said it was on my tab," she added. "They were mistaken," he said. She nodded. "All right." Nothing more followed. No clarification. No correction offered to the air between them. A man walking past slowed just enough to register the distance between them, then continued on. The town noticed, but not as a story. At the grocery store that evening, the cashier greeted Iris by name and asked whether she wanted the usual. She nodded. When Caleb reached the counter a moment later, the cashier said, "Your friend was in earlier." Caleb did not respond immediately. "She works nearby," he said. The cashier nodded, unfazed, and rang up the items. The word passed through without attachment, but it landed twice in the same place. Outside, the light was already thinning. Iris stood near the bike rack, adjusting the strap on her bag. Caleb exited a few steps behind her. They walked in the same direction for half a block. "You do not need to ask after me," Iris said, without looking at him. "I did not," Caleb replied. She slowed. "They said you did," she said. He considered this, then nodded once. "I see." They stopped near the corner. The boundary held, but it had moved. "I'm heading back," Iris said. "So am I," Caleb replied. They did not walk together. The next day, the adjustment showed itself again. Caleb passed the workshop in the morning and did not stop. The door was open. Iris was inside, visible through the glass. She did not look up. Later, Iris passed the dock without pausing. Caleb noticed from a distance and turned his attention back to the water. At the bar that evening, they sat farther apart than before. When Caleb stood to leave, he did not pass her table. He took the longer route around. No offense was taken. No repair was attempted. The consequence was not separation. It was precision. By the end of the week, the misinterpretation had lost its edge, but it had not disappeared. It had settled into the background, changing the way space was measured. Caleb stopped fixing what did not need fixing when Iris was nearby. Iris stopped waiting in places where he usually stood. The town adjusted around them without comment. The dock stayed steady. The shop stayed open. The street followed its curve toward the water. Nothing had gone wrong, but something had been named incorrectly once, and the echo of it had been enough to alter the shape of things. Not to close them, just to define where they now stood. The realization did not arrive as a thought Caleb Rowan could follow. It arrived as a change in order. Morning came in the same muted way it always did along this stretch of coast. Gray first, then a thin wash of light settling over the water without brightening it. The ocean moved with its usual patience. The dock held. The road curved and disappeared into fog, exactly where it always had. Caleb woke before the light reached the window. The kettle went on. The coffee followed. He stood by the window and listened to the water move, the sound steady enough to feel counted even without numbers. When the coffee was ready, he poured it and sat down. He did not open the notebook right away. That absence was new. The mug warmed his hands. He watched the surface of the water until the light shifted enough to break it into narrow bands. When he reached for the notebook, he opened it to a blank page, then closed it again without writing. Outside, a fishing boat passed without drawing any gulls behind it. Caleb stood and pulled on his coat. He stepped outside and paused, just long enough to register the direction his body expected him to take. He did not take it. Instead of turning toward the dock, he followed the longer road that bent inland before returning to the water. Fewer people used it. The ground stayed softer there, holding the damp longer into the day. Nothing announced the choice. Nothing resisted it. By the time he reached town, the street had already found its rhythm. A door opened farther down. Someone swept a step knowing the wind would undo it. The grocery store lights were on, steady and unchanged. Caleb went in. He took bread, soup, apples. He stood at the counter without shifting his weight. When the cashier rang him up, she said nothing beyond the total. Outside, the air felt colder than it had earlier. The fog thinned near the ground, thickening above. Caleb did not walk toward the dock. He passed the workshop instead. The door was open. Iris Calder stood inside, near the work table, hands moving with steady precision. The light from the street touched the edge of the fabric, then slid away again. She did not look up. Caleb slowed. Then he kept walking. The choice did not feel like restraint. It felt like alignment. Later that morning, Caleb reached the post office by the long route. He stood in line and waited. When it was his turn, he mailed a small package and stepped aside without checking the time. Outside, the harbor showed itself more clearly now. Nets hung stiff with salt. Ropes creaked against pilings. The water moved in its even way. Caleb stood near the edge of the pier for a moment, then turned back before settling into the spot where he usually stopped. The town did not react. It rarely did. Across town, Iris adjusted the position of a lamp in her workshop. Not because the light was wrong, because the angle had shifted with the season. She noticed it earlier now. When she stepped outside for air, she saw Caleb farther down the street, walking away from the dock instead of toward it. She registered the direction. She did not follow it with her eyes. That afternoon, a small repair waited near the bus stop. A loose board, the kind of thing Caleb would have fixed without thinking. He noticed it as he passed. He did not stop. A man sat on the bench later and adjusted his weight carefully. The board held anyway. In the early evening, Caleb went to the library. He returned a book and selected another without reading the back. This time, he chose from a shelf he rarely touched. He sat by the window until the light shifted enough to reach the page, then left. At the diner, he took a seat near the counter instead of the table by the window. The waitress brought coffee without asking. He drank it slowly. Iris came in later and took her usual seat. She ordered soup. They did not acknowledge each other. When Iris finished, she stood and paid. "I'm heading back," she said, to the room rather than to him. Caleb nodded once without turning. Outside, she walked toward the workshop. Caleb waited until she was gone before leaving in the opposite direction. The town absorbed the spacing without comment. On Sunday, Caleb went to the church. He arrived after the service had begun and slipped into the back pew as he always did. The wood creaked softly. Light filtered through the tall windows in narrow bands, settling on worn floors and old hymnals. No prayer spoken. No doctrine followed. Just wood. Light. The back pew. He sat until the room felt settled, then stood and left before the last hymn ended. Outside, the air was cold and clean. The road curved back toward the water. Caleb did not stop at the dock. He walked along the coastal path instead, boots steady on damp ground. The fence he had tightened days earlier held firm. The rocks near the water were slick and familiar. The seals were there again, resting together on the darker stone. He sat nearby and stayed longer than usual, not watching them directly, just the water moving around them. Nothing waited for him to act. When he stood again, cold had worked its way into his legs. He welcomed it. Across town, Iris closed the workshop later than planned. Not because she had to, because the work held. She locked the door and turned the sign. She took the longer route home, without considering why. The road curved with the coast. The sound of the water followed. She saw Caleb ahead of her for a brief moment, farther down the road, walking in the opposite direction. She did not call out. She did not slow. The realization took shape without language. Caleb stopped measuring his place by what he repaired. He noticed how often the town held on its own. How many things stayed intact without his hand on them. The town did not require more. It required accuracy. That evening, a chair wobbled at the bar near the harbor. Someone adjusted it with a folded napkin. The problem solved itself. Caleb finished his soup and paid. He left without fixing anything. When he passed the workshop later, the lights were on inside. Iris stood at the table, posture steady, attention on her work. Caleb slowed. He stopped. He did not step closer. Iris felt the pause and looked up. Their eyes met through the open space. Not searching, not waiting. She nodded once. He returned the nod. Then he stepped back and continued on. The exchange required nothing more. Iris did not follow him with her eyes. She finished what she was doing and set it aside to rest. The kiln was not part of her work. The heater clicked. The fabric cooled. The town moved toward night. Fog rolled in and softened the edges of everything. Lights came on behind windows and stayed on a little longer than expected. The harbor breathed. Caleb walked home by the longer route again. The routine had returned, but the order was different. Same places, different weight. And in that shift, something settled without needing to be named. Part 12. Return to routine. Changed. Morning returned without ceremony. The same gray light slid along the waterline, touching the dock before lifting just enough to show where the road curved back into town. The harbor moved in its usual rhythm. Net hung. Ropes creaked. Nothing announced that anything had shifted. Caleb Rowan woke before the light reached the window. The kettle went on. Coffee followed. He stood where he always stood and listened to the water. The sound was unchanged, but he did not measure it the same way. When the mug warmed his hands, he waited a moment longer before sitting down. The notebook stayed closed. He stepped outside and followed the coastal path. The fence along the bend held firm. Pebbles pressed into the damp ground where others had walked earlier. Farther out, the seals rested together on the darker rock, bodies still, heads lifting once before settling again. Caleb sat nearby, not as long as before, not shorter either. When he stood, he brushed sand from his coat and turned back without looking again. In town, the diner door opened and closed around him. He took his usual seat, but not the one closest to the window. Coffee arrived without asking. He drank it slowly. When the plate was cleared, he paid and stepped aside for the next person without thinking about it. The routine held. It simply arrived in a different order. At the grocery store, Caleb picked up bread, soup, apples. The cashier nodded once. No words were needed. Outside, a light drizzle darkened the pavement, then thinned. He passed the workshop mid-morning. The door was open. Iris Calder stood inside near the back table, fabric spread flat beneath her hands. The heater clicked on and off. The window reflected more of the street than before, the interior clearer from inside than out. Caleb did not slow. Inside, Iris noticed his reflection pass and dissolve as the light shifted. She did not move toward the door. She continued working, hands steady, the fabric responding as expected. Later, Iris stepped outside to adjust the sign. The air carried salt and damp wood. She looked toward the dock, then toward the road that led away from it. Both were quiet. She chose neither and went back inside. In the afternoon, Caleb went to the library. He returned the book he had finished and chose another without reading the back. He sat by the window until the light reached the page, then closed it and left before the room warmed. The same places, a different sequence. On Sunday, Caleb went to the church and sat in the back pew. Wood, light, stillness. He left before the final hymn ended, the sound trailing after him into the street. Iris worked with the door closed that day. Not locked, closed. The sign still read open. The town adjusted without comment. At dusk, they crossed paths on the coastal road. Iris walked toward town. Caleb walked away from it. They slowed just enough to register each other. Evening, Iris said. Evening, Caleb replied. They continued on. The water darkened. Lights came on behind windows. Fog rolled in and softened the edges of things that did not need sharpening. Maine stayed steady. The routines returned. They simply carried a different weight now. Underscore part 13. Open loop ending. Soft open yendi. The town did not mark an ending. It remained where it always had, held between water and weather, between routines that repeated and small choices that quietly rearranged them. Morning light continued to arrive without asking. Fog still moved in when it wanted to. The harbor breathed in its steady way. Caleb Rowan stood near the edge of the pier one evening as the light thinned. Not waiting, not watching for anyone in particular. Just there, hands resting on the rail, feeling the temperature drop as it always did after dusk. A boat passed farther out, engine low, leaving a line on the water that smoothed itself away almost immediately. Across town, Iris Calder turned off the lights in her workshop one by one. The heat from a day lingered in the wood and fabric, releasing slowly. She adjusted the strap of her bag and stepped into the street, choosing the longer route home. The road curved. The sound of the water followed. They did not meet that night. They did not need to. The bench at the bus stop held steady. The fence along the coastal path stayed firm. The bar near the harbor filled and emptied as it always did, stools taken and freed without ceremony. The church doors stood open some afternoons, quiet inside, wood and light doing their work without instruction. Nothing had been resolved. Nothing had been lost. What had changed was not the town, but the way it carried its people. Work mattered because it was done, not because it was seen. Distance meant respect as often as it meant space. Presence did not require explanation to be real. Caleb returned to his routines with one fewer gesture, and nothing collapsed without it. Iris continued her work without filling every gap, and the forms still held. The town adjusted around them, quietly, making room without comment. The road remained open in both directions. Some evenings, a light stayed on longer than expected. Other nights, it did not. Someone paused outside a window. Someone else kept walking. Both were allowed, and the town stayed there, unchanged enough to return to. Part 13. Open loop ending, soft open, the town remained. Morning arrived the same way it always had, thin light settling over the harbor before the fog decided whether to stay. The road curved where it always curved. The dock held its weight. Nothing closed itself behind anyone. Caleb Rowan stood near the water as evening lowered its temperature. He rested his hands on the rail, not looking for a signal, not waiting for a change. A boat passed farther out, engine low, leaving a line that softened and disappeared. The water returned to its even motion. Across town, Iris Calder turned off the lights in her workshop one by one. The room released the day slowly, warmth lingering in the wood and fabric. She adjusted the strap of her bag and stepped outside. The longer route home took her closer to the water. The sound followed her without effort. They did not meet. They did not need to. The bench at the bus stop stayed steady. The repaired fence along the coastal path held. The bar near the harbor filled and emptied, stools taken and returned without ceremony. The church doors opened some afternoons and closed again, wood and light left to do what they always did. Nothing had been settled in a way that needed to be named. Nothing had been undone. What had formed was quieter than resolution. Work continued without being claimed. Distance held its shape without becoming absence. Presence remained possible without demanding entry. Caleb returned to his routine with fewer corrections, and the town did not ask him to add them back. Iris continued her work without filling every space, and the forms still carried their weight. The rhythm adjusted itself around both of them, not bending, not resisting. Evenings came and went. Some nights, a light stayed on longer than expected. Other nights, it did not. A figure paused near a window and moved on. Another chose to keep walking. Both actions fit. The road remained open in both directions. The town stayed where it was, unchanged enough to return to, spacious enough to allow different ways of passing through it. Staying was permitted. Leaving was permitted. Neither needed explanation. And with the water moving as it always had, and the fog lifting and returning on its own schedule, the town held the space quietly, without asking what might happen next.